There's at one point of the story where Odysseus has to sail between the monster Scylla and Charybdis, the pit, and he has to sail right between the two. And we have to sail between these things, the technology on the one hand and the postmodernism on the other hand. And how do we chart a course through? Well, we have to follow the thread. We have to be able to follow the thread back into the past to be able to see where these things kind of came from and where they may have arisen from in the first place. And I think that when we follow it back, we can go back to sort of the technological and industrial and scientific revolutions that really gave birth to modernity. And we'll go back, further, but I want to first just in this episode just talk a little bit about the early part of the 20th century. And I want to talk about World War II and sort of the post World War world and how some of these things came about. That through the two world wars, we saw the rise of this rapid arms race of technology and industry, and so we saw a lot of major figures arising during this time. I think it's very interesting that and poetically fitting that the story that Christopher Nolan is telling now is the Odyssey, and the previous film that he made just previous to this one was Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer was a story about J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is considered to be, is known to be like the father of the atomic bomb, essentially. That J. Robert Oppenheimer was one of these figures who was pushing technology and development and industry and science forward in this kind of rapid way, because we had to beat the Nazis, right? So it's like we've got to get the technology before they do. And so the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb, was led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, and if you haven't seen the film Oppenheimer, it's really powerful. It's really wonderful film as well. So I would encourage you to check that out. But Oppenheimer is such a fascinating figure because he's this really potent figure, and he's pushing technology and he is advancing it, and they're developing the atomic bomb. And like the first half of the story in the film is about that, about can we build the bomb? But then the second half of the story is, what have we done, right? Like, what have we built? Like, is this thing actually going to destroy us? And there's this fear that Oppenheimer has of like, oh no, what have we unleashed upon the world? Like, we've opened Pandora's box, and what is being unleashed upon the world? And it's very fascinating because we know from the story of Oppenheimer's life that he kind of spent his first half of his life building this project and being a part of this advancement. But then the second half was really spent in essentially trying to put the genie back into the bottle. Essentially, he spent much of his latter end of his life advocating against the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. That he essentially he was essentially attempting to unmake that thing that had been made, or at least to try to protect the world from it. Because at the end of the film, Oppenheimer, there's this really powerful image where he's like imagining what might happen, and he's imagining this nuclear fire spreading across the face of the earth, and it's spreading and it's spreading and it's spreading, and it might ultimately lead to the destruction of everything as we know it. And so there's that fear. And it's interesting as well that the story of Oppenheimer is the story of, essentially, it's the story of Prometheus. And I want to talk about that story as well, that the film Oppenheimer is based on a book, and the book about the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer is called Prometheus Unbound. And that's a reference to this myth of Prometheus. And the myth of Prometheus, in a lot of ways, is the story of the descent, just like the Odyssey is the story of the descent and then the return. The story of Prometheus has to do, and this is the connection with Oppenheimer, the story of Prometheus has to do with fire. That in the deep primordial past, mankind basically lived in darkness. That this was before technology had been discovered. There was no science, there was no technology, there was no industry, there was not even fire. And so people lived in the dark, they lived in the hidden caves, they were afraid to come out at night, they were preyed upon by predators and all these kinds of things. And so they lived constantly in fear and all of that. And the gods looked down on humanity and they refused to do anything about it. They refused to give humanity the power to make fire. They withheld it from humanity. All except for one. There was one who looked down on humanity and had pity and compassion on people, and that was Prometheus. And so Prometheus goes secretly by night, he goes and he steals fire from the gods. He steals fire, he steals a coal from the altar of the gods, and he gives it to mankind. And then very soon thereafter, we start to see campfires being lit and torches being lit. And that is the beginning of technology. That is the beginning of civilization in a lot of ways, because it is fire that brings us together around the flames so that we can tell the story to one another. And so culture begins to grow and society begins to grow. And so people start to not be afraid anymore. And so it's this story of like the compassion of Prometheus. Well, the gods are not very happy about that, however. So what they do is they bring Prometheus to court and they put him on trial for defying the gods, essentially, and he's condemned to be bound forever to a mountain. And so they chain Prometheus to the side of a mountain, and Prometheus is constantly being pecked by vultures and crows who they very graphically, they peck out his liver and they eat his liver. And so they peck him apart. But the thing is, of course, he's immortal, right? Because he's divine. And so he can't die. And so he's just condemned forever to live in hell, essentially, to be bound to this mountain forever as a punishment for his compassion on humanity, until one day Hercules climbs the mountain, breaks the chains of Prometheus, and sets him free, which is also a very powerful and beautiful story. Maybe we'll visit that at some point. But the story of Prometheus basically is the story of science, that Prometheus has long been a figure who is identified with technology and with science and with progressive advancement of technology and so forth. And so he's sort of the patron saint of technology and of science. But there's a question that's raised in the story, which is fascinating, that Prometheus gives fire to mankind, and the gods don't want that to happen. But there's this kind of question, there's this sort of ambiguity in the story, which is the question of like, why don't the gods want to give fire to humanity? And there's two competing narratives. One is that the gods are cruel. The gods are cruel and power hungry and tyrannical, and they do not want humanity to raise itself up out of darkness. And so they want to keep humanity subservient. And so they refuse to give them fire because they're afraid that if they do, that humanity will become too powerful and will challenge them in their rule. So that's one narrative. The second narrative is maybe not. Maybe the reason why the gods refused to give fire to humanity is because they knew in their divine foresight, they knew what humanity would do with the fire. That they wouldn't just use it to tell stories around the flames or to cook their food or to bring light and warmth and joy, that they would use fire as a weapon, that they would use fire to destroy one another, that they would use it to burn down forests, to destroy the world around them, that they were essentially afraid that humanity would destroy itself. And so it was out of mercy and compassion that the gods denied fire to humanity. That's another story, right? But they're both contained within the same narrative, that it could be either. It could be both. And this is sort of the question that still lingers in the background of our minds, even in the world today, that we see sort of this conflict between science and religion, right? We see this conflict between, and it is also the political conflict oftentimes between progressive and conservative, that there's this idea of like wanting scientific advancement, but then also knowing that it is scientific advancement and technology that might actually bring about ruin. And this is the story of Oppenheimer, that he is Prometheus. He gives fire to humanity, and then he's like, oh no, what have I done? And this is, I think, the case for us as well. And so we see the beginnings of technology in the story of Prometheus. Now, there's another interesting figure in the film Oppenheimer. We also see another powerful scientific figure from the early part of the 20th century, and that is Albert Einstein, right? So we have Oppenheimer and we have Einstein, and Einstein also was one of these incredibly powerful figures in terms of the advancement of science in the early part of the 20th century, particularly with his his two theories of relativity, right? That Einstein is most famous for his theory of general relativity and his theory of special relativity, and all of the significance that has had on the on modern science, the development of physics, and so forth going forward into the future. And so Einstein has had a tremendous effect on science, and so is extremely well known for this. Much more so, I would say, than with Oppenheimer. But there's a similarity between these two figures, which I think is fascinating, which is that Oppenheimer had this fear of giving fire to man through technology, that by unleashing nuclear power on the world, that it might destroy us, that it might spread like wildfire, as it did in the case of Prometheus. But there's, I think, a subtle way in which the ideas of Einstein have also spread in a similar way. And as we're thinking about the films and the stories of Christopher Nolan, another one that comes to mind is Inception, where this is a story essentially about dreams and about ideas and the subconscious and the ways in which the subconscious affect us and can shape the direction of our lives. It's about the power of an idea. And there's a part in the story where it's discovered that there's an idea that's been planted in the mind of one of the characters, and that idea has essentially that it's gone deep within that person, and it has changed the trajectory of that person's life. And I think that part of the descent, part of the going down into the self, is recognizing those ideas, the ideas that have come to shape who we are. And sometimes those ideas may actually be false. There may be ideas about ourselves or about the world in which we live that have shaped us that are not true, that they're not in keeping with reality, and we need to be willing to recognize those and to essentially reject them. But they can be deeply in there, right? They need to be actually replaced with a different idea. Or sometimes there can be ideas that are true ideas, but that even true ideas, sometimes that there can be unexpected results that flow out of those ideas, and it can be sort of this domino effect of those things going on to influence our lives in ways, even though the idea itself might be true, they can influence us in ways that we hadn't expected, and that we need to actually take that time to sort of recalibrate back again. And I think that that's something that we need to do individually, and it's also that we need to recognize culturally as well.